So I am a researcher in modern languages and in German studies in particular. And in terms of the materials that I look at in my research, I focus mainly on cultural production. So in my case, that means literary texts and also a bit of theatre in the contemporary German language context. In terms of the topics that I look at, my main topics are minorities and their histories of migration, either direct or indirect experiences, and also the experiences they make in terms of inclusion and exclusion. And one key question for me is how representation of these experiences in various artworks can help us to approach them in alternative ways, mostly increasing things such as inclusion and solidarity. Currently, I am quite interested in the question of what creative approaches and creative methods can bring to how we engage with very violent pasts and presents. And I think one thing that interests me in that context is how they can allow us to remember those events differently, especially when there wasn't any kind of collective remembrance of those events, or when there wasn't any kind of state-sponsored remembrance. For example, if you think of terrorist attacks, which are not perpetrated by state actors at all times, how they're remembered works quite differently from a war, for example. And the other question that interests me in that context is how these creative approaches can help us think about the future differently and to hopefully work towards less violent futures. And the specific context that I'm interested in for my research with that is post-unification Germany, which since the 1990s has seen quite a string of extremely right-wing racialized attacks on various minorities, and those attacks really weren't remembered adequately at the time. There often weren't any proper police or other investigations, so justice in many cases wasn't delivered. And also the dominant approach in Germany is that all of these are one-off events, so no one ever really thinks about how we might be able to stop them for the future. So I think the questions of how we can remember these events differently, or in many cases at all, the questions of what justice might look like in the current moment, but also, some of these events, justice wasn't brought at the time. What can we do now to maybe redress some of that? But I think also really importantly, the question of how do we not reproduce that violence endlessly into the future? They're really, really important. And I think in the German context, because there is a relative absence, at least until very recently, of deeper engagement with these questions, because they weren't seen as the problem of majority German society. I think turning to the arts and turning to creative approaches might be really helpful for coming up with some responses to those very important questions. I think the question of how do I go about it practically can in many ways not be separated from what I think is one of the biggest challenges. I think one of the major challenges for all humanities research, but I think particularly for people working on literature or any other artistic kind of representation, is always the question, okay, what does it actually do? What do you do by reading texts all day? What does it contribute to what's happening in the real world? And this is something I think about a lot, and it's also something I've discussed with various colleagues a lot, and I think everyone comes up with their own kinds of answers to these questions. I guess for me in my research, the things that have been important and that I would like to highlight are that, sort of as a literary scholar, kind of the narratives and the images that we have available, they really matter in terms of what narratives and images are dominant in a certain culture, because, for example, if you're not represented in a culture, it can really impact your abilities to participate. I think also the language that we use around certain topics really matters, and we can see that in the context of my research, but also more broadly in the UK, for example. The way we talk about migration, it really matters, whether we use the language that's very common at the moment, which is very fear-inducing, painting it as a threat, or whether maybe a different language might be possible that would make people feel more welcome. And I think as literary scholars, we are really good at analyzing these narratives, these images, the use of these languages critically, because we have those tools. And then I think what literary texts can do is really expand the repertoire that we have. So those are really places in which I think we can come up with alternative images, new images, images that challenge certain images that came before. So I think they're really vital if we want to make the world we live in a more inclusive space. And I think a final point for me that's really important for the research I'm currently doing is that I think it's really vital to have spaces in which we can think about alternatives to what is currently given, and in which we can creatively experiment with alternative ways of approaching others or the world. because I think we often think of change as a very practical matter. So what is it we need to change and how do we go about it? I think it's also a question of imagination and of emotions. And I think those are the spaces in which literature and the arts can be really helpful, because they can allow us to play through certain options, to feel our way through certain scenarios, to think through all the consequences that there might be to a certain decision. And that might then become the seed for wider ranging change. But I think without those imaginative possibilities, there won't be any change at all.